Hey folks, it's Nate. Thanks for joining me at the art table again today. The mentor is an interesting character in fiction. He is most typically understood in the Joseph Campbell sense of the monomyth, a character that teaches the protagonist some deep skills of life and prepares him to step across the threshold into the larger world. Now, this particular role of the mentor is all well and good, but in general, in storytelling, the mentor also gives you an opportunity to explain how the character knows things. If your protagonist has a mentor, we automatically understand that some of their skills have been passed down from the mentor as part of the learning process. In a sports team movie, for example, the coach is understood to be where the athletes are getting most of their know-how about how the game works. For the purposes of discussions that I've been having on this channel, the mentor is also the touchstone for the legacy characters carry. They are the avenue by which the past touches the present, and through which the richness and the tragedy of the legacy you are examining can be most clearly conveyed. However, there is an inversion of the mentor trope that is very interesting to consider, and that is the mentor as villain. When you consider the mentor as villain, generally what you look at is the mentor's best qualities pushed a little bit too far. The role of the mentor is to be very strict with the protagonist and teach them the harshness and difficulties as well as the beauties and wonders of the particular skill set they are trying to undertake. The idea of mentor as villain is very clearly illustrated by the character of Terence Fletcher in Whiplash. This character, portrayed by the excellent J.K. Simmons, is a conductor at a musical conservatory, and his students are supposed to learn all the nuances of true professional musical performance from him. But it turns out he's really just sort of an abusive jerk. And yes, the swearing and the public embarrassment and the browbeatings and even the physical abuse is justified as a way to bring out a person's full potential. A mentor has to be strict, but Fletcher is strict to a cartoonish degree. He is, in short, abusive. And there is a question of whether he draws out more from his students than they would have given to anyone else. But it doesn't change the fact that he is a villain in their lives. Many great musicians self-destruct, and in the character of Terence Fletcher, we see one of their self-destructive tendencies embodied in an actual person. That is one of the brilliant aspects of the mentor as villain. They are a warning of what can happen to you if you do not approach your craft with the correct mindset. The mentor as villain can also stand as a warning of all the terrible things that pursuing your craft can drive you to. A great example of this is the character of J. Jonah Jameson, a news editor who purchases photographs from Peter Parker. He embodies all the sleazy parts of the news trade. He is a successful newspaper editor. The Daily Bugle does quite well for itself in most incarnations of the Spider-Man mythos. And if you look at J. Jonah Jameson, particularly as he is portrayed in the first Sam Raimi Spider-Man movie, as embodied by the excellent J.K. Simmons, Jameson actually has a certain degree of integrity. After all, when the Green Goblin shows up to demand the name of the person who takes the Spider-Man photos, Jameson doesn't give him up. That is an important thing for newspaper editors. They have to protect their sources. That is ethical behavior for a newspaper man. But for the most part, J. Jonah Jameson is a terrible person. He doesn't really teach Peter anything positively. He's really just a bad example of what the news business is for Peter to bounce off of and, to a certain degree, rebel against. A third and final example of the mentor as villain would be Omni-Man from Invincible. Now, Omni-Man is, in point of fact, Vince's role model, and his dad. He is an example of what a hero is supposed to be up until a certain point. The problem is that Omni-Man is not sincere in his heroism. He does not actually have altruistic motives. He's worming himself into a place where he has enough trust from the general populace that he can conquer the planet. Omni-Man, for a brief period of time, insincerely embodies excellent values, and then he betrays those values and forces a choice upon Invincible, whether he is going to continue to trust in those values or whether he is going to follow his father down the path of destruction. Omni-Man, voiced by the great J.K. Simmons in the Amazon TV series, embodies the charisma of good morals and how they can be manipulated by vile people to sucker others in. But ultimately, the morals prove to be stronger than Omni-Man himself, because Vince chooses them over his father. When the mentor serves as villain in this respect, they elevate the legacy they carry by showing it is in fact that legacy, the morals and values they embody, that made them so appealing in the first place, not the personal charisma of the mentor themselves, however charismatic they might be. And believe me, when you're voiced by J.K. Simmons, you can be pretty charismatic. Now, the mentor as villain is a really interesting element to add to the consideration of legacy, because, as I said, the mentor often embodies the legacy that the protagonist is trying to pick up and carry. The pitfalls of that have already been discussed to a certain extent when I discussed legacy and tragedy. But the mentor as villain is more than just the tragedy that has come along with the legacy you are trying to carry. They represent some aspect of the legacy that has never quite worked as intended. Legacies are big and complex, and often a person seeking to embody that legacy will not perfectly embody every aspect of it. But if they face the mentor as villain, the villain embodies one particular part of their legacy, their morals or their craft, that the protagonist must master in order to carry the legacy forward into the next generation. This is a point of failure so great, a tragedy so backbreaking, that until it is resolved, the entire project that the protagonist has undertaken is in peril. The villainous mentor's warped insistence on this one point does not necessarily mean the protagonist has to compromise in order to carry the legacy, but it does underline some failure in the project undertaken that the protagonist must resolve. Now you know that I have largely been examining this idea of legacy through the lens of Akane-banashi, a series about a rakugo performer whose father was expelled from his school and whose reputation she is trying to rehabilitate. If you've been reading this series already, you are well aware of who the mentor as villain is, namely Isho Arakawa. Isho does not begin the story as Akane's mentor. Rather, she begins under the tutelage of Shiguma Arakawa, the teacher who also instructed her father. But at a certain point in the story, Shiguma is no longer healthy enough to have students, and Akane's tutelage is passed from Shiguma to his fellow school member, Isho. This is, I think, an excellent attempt to have the cake and eat it too. We get a good, positive mentor figure in Shiguma for about 120 chapters of the story. Then we get one of the strongest twists I've seen in manga for some time, when Akane's tutelage is passed to the man she hates most in the Arakawa school. The addition of a time jump after that happened was a bit of an interesting choice. I wasn't a huge fan of it, as it does kind of skip over some of the character development I would like to see as a result of this occurrence. But since we learned that Akane has been overseas in France for most of the time that was skipped over, and she was not in fact directly learning from Isho Arakawa during this time, I think it works out pretty well. Isho Arakawa as a teacher is an interesting phenomenon. He does not seem to be in the habit of explaining himself. Admittedly, we don't have a whole lot of information to go on that front, but it is what we have seen so far. That tendency is in very strong conflict with his perfectionist attitude. Isho Arakawa expects everything to be perfect and for people to figure out how to get a perfect performance with very little feedback from him. It is clearly and obviously a toxic way to teach a student. But he doesn't do things with no reason. Yes, he doesn't explain why he sends Akane to France for 3 years, but we do see something very interesting when she comes back. In her first performance after returning from overseas, we see Akane telling a story about learning to yawn. Now, the nature of that story is not really important. What is important is that there are several stretches in it where Akane must evoke a specific mood in the audience. She must describe a scene so vividly that the audience is transported to that place and time. And that's important, because when Akane's father was expelled, he had just performed a story known as Shibahama. We don't know the entirety of the story of Shibahama yet. I'm sure someone somewhere has gone and looked it up, but I'm happy to wait until the narrative of akane-banashi expounds on it at length. What we do know is that there is a stretch in Shibahama where the storyteller must convey their skill with words in describing the shoreline of Shibahama. It is a vital part of the story, at least in the view of Isho Arakawa. It was also a part of the story that was omitted by Akane's father, Shinta, when he performed the story. And given how displeased Isho Arakawa seemed at that omission, it may be part of why Shinta was ultimately expelled. By sending Akane to France, Isho seems to have shored up this shortcoming in her father's art style. This is particularly important as Isho and Akane are clashing over an unfinished story referred to as Shiguma's art. In order to master this story, we are told that first, a performer must master 3 previous stories, one of which is Shibahama. In other words, without explaining himself, it seems that Isho is trying to craft Akane into a performer who can master this story. However, the whole time, he is trying to browbeat her out of learning it. This is the exact kind of toxic and abusive behavior that defines the mentor as villain. Yes, he wants Akane to succeed in this, but he is also demanding that Akane prove her worthiness of the story by trying to drive her away the entire time. Yes, perhaps Isho will be able to draw out Akane's maximum potential this way. But there are many other artists whose potential he has destroyed through this behavior, and we've seen this happen time and again. Isho is not a purveyor of lessons to be learned. He's a placer of obstacles that must be overcome. In time, he may come to be the perfect example of a mentor as the villain. That's what I'm really looking forward to seeing, and I hope if akane-banashi is ever animated and given an American dub, to hear him voiced by J.K. Simmons, because let's face it, the man is a genius in this part. Regardless, I will keep you appraised of how akane-banashi develops its themes of legacy and storytelling in the modern era, because I really do find it fascinating and fun to dive into. Let me know what you think of this approach down in the comments below. While you're down there, there's a like button and a subscribe button. You can use those as you see fit. If you'd like to support the channel, you can also find a link to pick up my book on Amazon there, Have Spell Will Travel, a collection of 4 novellas and 4 short stories. It's the only way I ask you to support if you are interested in doing so, so I'd love it if you would check it out. I'll talk to you later.